I think the headline of this war is that Ukraine is eventually going to win it. And by win, I mean evicting of the Russian military from Ukrainian sovereign territory, including Crimea and including the Donbass. And that's how the Ukrainians are defining victory.
It isn't usual for generals to talk about their military strategy on the TV, but that is what Russia's commander in Ukraine did when he said that his forces were pulling out of Kherson. So is this Russia accepting that it is losing perhaps a battle or the war, or a trap? Dr. Mike Martin is Senior War Studies Fellow at King's College London. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Now, you'll know, of course, the reason that this general has given for this particular move. They said that Russian forces in Kherson had been isolated from their supply lines because the Ukrainians had been attacking those lines with missiles, and that it would be futile to try to hold back a Ukrainian advance. Does that sound credible to you? Do you think that's what it is, or do you think it's something else?
I think that's 100% credible. Logistics are utterly key to warfare. Amateurs talk tactics and professionals talk logistics.
Hmm.
And this is actually what the Ukrainians have set out to do. Your listeners might remember in August, President Zelensky said, from September, we'll be starting to push on Kherson. And here we are, 2 months later, and the Russians are pulling out of Kherson. And what the Ukrainians have very, very systematically done over the last 2 or 3 months is, as you said, they knocked the Kerch Bridge out, which was a major supply line. They've been attacking railway depots, fuel dumps, rail lines, and an army that's not supplied can't defend itself. And so the Russians have been forced to pull out.
And what does this pullout mean for Russian progress in that particular part of Ukraine, or how does it connect with their successes or failures in the rest of the country?
I think it connects to their failures in the rest of the country. The high watermark of Russian territorial control, if you like, was about April.
Mm.
And since then, we've had the pullout from north of Kyiv. We've had in September, we had that massive retaking of territory in the northeast around Kharkiv. And now we see a pullout in the south in Kherson. So territorial control, which is one measure of success, there are others, but it's a pretty key one. That's all been going Ukraine's way over the last 6 months.
What does this mean? There are many people uh, who just want, of course, the war to end. I'm not just talking about Ukrainians. I'm talking about obviously their allies throughout the
Yeah.
rest of the world. Does this get us any closer to Russia pulling out completely? I mean, I know that there are areas that they've dug in too deeply in, but the rest of the country, how hopeful should we actually be?
I think the headline of this war is that Ukraine is eventually going to win it. And by win, I mean evicting of the Russian military from Ukrainian sovereign territory, including Crimea and including the Donbass. And that's how the Ukrainians are defining victory. And the reason I think that is because the fundamentals, if you look at the two sides, the fundamentals of warfare are strategy, morale, and logistics.
Mm.
And if you look at all of those three things, the Ukrainians are trending upwards and the Russians are trending downwards. What we're going to see now is a bit of a pause over winter because warfare becomes much more difficult in winter, specifically the logistics. And then we'll see in March or so, we'll see a spring offensive. Both sides will obviously try to do a spring offensive. And I think we'll probably see the war wrapping up late summer 2023, I would think, in Ukraine's favor. Russia's simply not, and this has been a shock to many people, but Russia is not the well-oiled military machine that we thought it was.
Mm.
It's been an appalling performance.
I think many people have seen that throughout, but I suppose it's when they were trying to carry out referendums, for example, or carried out referendums in certain cities that they seemed to have a real
Mm,
stranglehold on,
mm,
their
mm,
entrenchment in Donbass. I
mm.
think those were the things that people, were thinking meant that
Yeah,
this would go
yeah.
on a lot longer. But you seem to think that, well, what will happen to
Mm.
those particular areas where they seem to be
Yeah.
they seem to be
Mm.
in control?
Well, one of those areas was Kherson.
Mm.
I mean, so
Yes.
Kherson was one of the areas that had a referendum and was formally annexed. So, according to Russia, Kherson is part of it's Russian territory.
Mm.
So, what we're seeing is a pullout in Russia's eyes. We're seeing a pullout from Russian territory, and I think just zoom out a bit. You've actually hit the nail on the head. What this is a complete disconnect between Russia's political strategy, which originally, remember, was to take control of Ukraine, depose the government, and install their own people in power,
Mm.
and the military reality. And Putin declaring we've annexed these regions, the Duma, the Russian parliament accepting that, and then, as a result of these sort of sham referenda, the military clearly at the time, or perhaps they weren't, but the military clearly couldn't hold that territory, and now the military is pulling out. And I think it's interesting that it was the military that announced the pullout yesterday and not Putin. So Putin announces annexations, the military announces pullouts. A complete disconnect at the top level of the Russian government, which is, this military civilian interface at the top of any government is how strategy is formed. And right from the beginning, that's been broken in the Russian system.
Yes. Mike, thank you very much. Really fascinating. Dr. Mike Martin, Senior War Studies Fellow at King's College, London.
If the government are hearing,
Yep.
If the government are hearing that notion that the war could be over by the middle of next year, that will impact all sorts of things, won't it? Because it means this budget has to survive this winter, and gas prices could then come down. All sorts of things will change that might mean they could have a different sort of budget for the years that follow. And that would be a huge thing. We were talking yesterday about something will turn up.
Yeah.
There has to be something that changes. And let's hope Mike Martin isn't being too optimistic when he actually puts a date on the end of the war, and it's, what's that now? Sort of eight or 9 months away.